Hi, Sam here with jbugs.com. With the link pin disc brake drop spindles installed in our last video, we can start wrapping up the front end on our 1963 Resto Custom Beetle. We will be installing a sway bar, new brake rotors, brake calipers, narrowed tie rods, and a pair of Koni Classic adjustable shock absorbers. We start with the sway bar and install larger sway bar bushings onto either end of our narrowed 2-inch sway bar, followed by 2 smaller bushings. Then the sway bar is held in place across the bottom tube of the front beam, against the lower trailing arms, and the bushings are aligned with the trailing arms at either side. Empty stainless steel T-bolt sway bar clamps are wrapped around the trailing arms and the sway bar bushings. The T-bolt clamps are tightened down a bit to hold the sway bar in place. The clamps will be fully tightened once the wheels are on the car and it's on its own weight. To install the brakes, our new rotors need to have the bearing races installed before we can install them onto the spindles. We recommend pressing in the bearing races to avoid cracking the brake rotors, and since we don't have a press in our warehouse, we enlisted the help of a local shop to press in the inner and outer races into both disc brake rotors. Back in our warehouse, at our workbench, the wheel bearings are packed with grease. I use a plastic bag and grab a handful of grease, using the bag as a glove. Then a bearing can be grabbed, and the bag can be wrapped inside out, squeezing the bag, forcing all the grease into the bearing. The inner bearing is done first, then set into the back of the brake rotor, into the bearing race. Then an inner wheel seal is set in place, pressed down, and tapped gently to make sure it's fully seated. The outer bearing is packed with grease next, and set in place into the outer bearing race. Now at the front of the car, the rotor is slid over the spindle while holding the outer bearing in place. Then a keyed thrust washer is aligned with the spindle and slid into place, followed by the appropriate left-hand or right-hand threaded axle nut. The left side axle nut is left-hand or reverse threaded. The right-hand nut is right-hand or standard threaded. The axle nut is tightened down while checking to make sure that the rotor spins freely and checking for any wobble or play in and out on the rotor. Loosen or tighten the axle nut as needed, and then tighten the set screw on the axle nut to lock the axle nut in place. Now a new ball joint style grease cap is tapped into place onto the brake rotor to seal the bearings. The brake rotor is then cleaned with brake cleaner to ensure all the grease and oil from the packaging is cleaned off. Back at the workbench, we prep the brake pads which come pre-installed on the caliper with some brake pad disc brake lube on the back. In between the pad and the caliper, and the opposite pad and the brake piston. The pads are pushed back into place and the caliper is taken over to the car where the pads are cleaned with brake cleaner. Then the caliper is slid in place over the rotor, noting that the bleeder valve is at the top of the piston. This is the correct orientation and will allow the calipers to be bled properly later. The caliper is bolted to the spindle, and after checking that the caliper is not contacting the rotor at the front or back side, the caliper bolts are tightened down. If the caliper were to hit the rotor, washers can be placed in between the caliper bracket and the spindle as spacers. The rotor and caliper are installed on the opposite side following the same procedures. Now the left and right narrowed tie rods can be installed to the front end, bolting the shorter tie rod to the left spindle and the pitman arm. The right side inner tie rod end has a hole for the steering damper. That end is bolted to the pitman arm, and the opposite end is bolted to the right spindle. You might notice that the right side tie rod is hitting the tunnel. When the car is on its own weight, this will not be an issue, as the spindle will sit higher, moving the tie rod away from the tunnel. A new steering damper is attached to the inner tie rod end, then to the beam, and the lock plate is bent over on the beam bolt. The steering wheel is turned so that the pitman arm is pointing straight back, and now the length on the left and right tie rod ends are adjusted so that the rotors are roughly parallel with each other. A more proper alignment will be done later. We will be installing new steel brake lines at the front when we swap out the master cylinder, so the original lines are removed from the master cylinder and the brake hose clips are pulled so we can remove the hoses and lines from the chassis. New brake hoses are installed at both calipers and tightened down. The hoses are then routed to the chassis brackets and held in place with new brake line clips. Next, Koni Classic adjustable shocks will be installed to control the suspension. The shocks have internal adjusters that allow you to soften or stiffen the shock by compressing the shock fully, and then twisting the shock clockwise to increase or counterclockwise to decrease the stiffness of the shock. As the front of a Beetle is very light and we want a comfortable ride, the shocks are set to the softest setting and then bolted onto the lower front trailing arm. Then the trailing arm is pushed up so the upper shock bolt can be installed. The narrowed beam towers sit closer to the body than the stock beam, so caution is used while tightening the shock bolt, as we do not want the bolts pushing through the body. Once the bolt is touching the body, we take note of how much bolt length is left, then remove the bolt and install some spacers on the bolt so it can be tightened down safely. Spacers or washers work fine in this instance, as well as of course with shortening the bolt or using a shorter 12 by 1.5 millimeter threaded bolt. Now we're ready to install the front wheels and tires. Stock size tires will not clear with drop spindles, so low profile tires are required. We're using 135s mounted on Empy's 5.5 inch wide, gloss black BRM wheels. The wheels won't fit with stock lug bolts, so an Empy 12mm chrome stud and nut kit is used to mount the wheels. First, the studs are threaded into the brake rotor. Then the wheel is set in place over the studs. Then the lug nuts are threaded on and snugged down. We still have to finish tightening down the sway bar and need to get under the car with the car on the ground. As the car will sit much lower than stock, a pair of drive-on ramps are slid under the front tires. Then a jack is used to lift the front end up off the jack stands, and the car is lowered onto the ramps. Under the car, all 4 sway bar clamps are tightened down. The additional length in the bolts will be cut off with a grinder and cutoff wheel later. For now, we can roll the car off the ramps and get a better idea of the lowered stance on our front end. You might remember we have the front end adjusted to the highest point. We can lower the car much more from here, but we won't yet, as the front springs are still brand new and will settle a lot once the car is driven a bit. Resist the temptation to slam the car to the ground. Drive it for a bit and wait for the front suspension to settle before setting the final ride height. Next up, we'll be lowering the rear suspension, installing rear disc brakes, and then we will install a new master cylinder along with some replacement steel brake lines and bleed the brakes, and we'll be one step to completing our suspension and brake upgrades on our Resto Custom Beetle. We hope this front end series has helped you all at home. If you have any questions or are looking for some more information on some of the products we've used, stop by jbugs.com.